Good evening. I'm Srinivas Chokkakula. I'm the President and Chief Executive of Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. I also lead this TREADS initiative that you must have seen, which is Transboundary Rivers, Ecologies, and Development Studies. We call them initiative at CPR, Center for Policy Research. They're actually focused research clusters. We work on a specific issue, and TREADS works primarily on water, focused on transboundary water governance. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all for this second edition of TREADS annual lecture that is given by Dr. Uttam Sinha, titled The Shifting Logic of Indus Waters Treaty. And we also have Ambassador Ashok Kantha with us as a discussant. Thank you for both for agreeing to be part of this. Let me do the formal introductions very briefly. Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for doing the honors. Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha is a leading voice on transboundary water governance, climate change, and Arctic geopolitics. He joined the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, now Manohar Parrikar IDSA, in 2001. As a senior fellow, he leads the Center for Non-Traditional Security and serves as the managing director of Strategic Analysis, the Institute's flagship journal, published by Routledge. Over the years, he has held prestigious fellowships and leadership positions, including as senior fellow at the Prime Minister's Museum and Library, academic visitor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Chevening Gurukul Fellow at LSE, and visiting fellow at Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Among his many publications, he is the author of the book that I just mentioned about, Trial by Water, Indus Basin and India-Pakistan Relations, and the widely acclaimed, the earlier one, prequel, if you want to call it, Indus Basin Interrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru, both of them published by Penguin Random House. He recently co-edited a special issue for Strategic Analysis journal, Changing Dynamics, on changing dynamics in the Architect, Actors and Alliances. He writes regularly for Times of India and Indian Express. Thank you, Dr. Sinha, for joining us today again. Ambassador Kantha is former career diplomat who served as secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, Secretary East, and ambassador or high commissioner to China, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. He is an honorary fellow and former director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, a distinguished fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi, and also a distinguished fellow at Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi, and chair of core group on China of Confederation of Indian Industry. In his diplomatic career, Ambassador Kantha specialized in India's neighborhood and extended neighborhood with a particular focus on China and South Asia. Our plan is to have the lecture for about 35 to 40 minutes by Dr. Sinha, and then it would be followed by Ambassador Kantha's remarks as a discussant for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we open for question and answer. I'll be moderating the discussion. Thank you. So can I request Dr. Sinha to deliver his lecture? Thank
you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite a pleasure to be delivering this second TREADS annual lecture. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas, for inviting me. When you asked me to deliver the lecture, I looked at the mirror and said, "Oh, I have totally grayed now." And you asked me also not to have PowerPoint, I think. I've long believed that power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I've been often told, and this is when I was doing my book, that it's good to have maps. And I think it's something of an art that we have lost recently. We tend to forget geography. We do not look at maps. So when you do look at the Indus Basin, you will get a good sense of how really the sharing works, what are the difficulties that India has in sharing that water, what are the dynamics of upper riparian and lower riparian. So I think it's good.
You can speak closer to the mic.
Okay, sorry.
There are some senior citizens sitting here.
No, I have got a very soft voice, so that's better. So what I'm trying to say is it's good to look at maps. So thank you, Srinivas, and also thank you, Ambassador Kantha, for being here. I will certainly and keenly hear what you have to say after my talk. It's a privilege to speak here, as I said, because I think it is a subject that is both historical and urgent. It is both technical and, I think, profoundly political. The shifting logic of the Indus Waters Treaty. And we have, over the last couple of months, engaged ourselves deeply as to the faith of this treaty. So let me begin with a very simple proposition. History demands to be looked at twice. Right? We look at history once to understand the context, to understand the compulsions, the constraints, and even the fears within which a decision was taken, a decision then in the 50s. That first gauge helps us to see why something happened the way it did. But we must also look at history a second time, not merely to recall what happened, but to distill its lessons. I think that is very important today, to distill the lessons of the 50s and the Indus Waters Treaty. This second gaze is analytical and instructive, asking what has changed, what must evolve, and what can no longer endure simply because it once worked under different circumstances. In both cases, however, whether we examine history for its context or for its lessons, we must resist the temptation to look back in anger. We should not look at history with anger. And I think this is where facts matter. And we should study the entire 50, the negotiation, and the eventual signing of the Indus Waters Treaty purely from factual accounts. The Indus Waters Treaty exemplifies this dual gauge, right? It was signed in 1960, September 19th, and shaped by the mistrust of the partition. So you had a long period, 1947 to 1960, where a lot happened as the Indus Waters Treaty was being negotiated. Revisiting the treaty therefore becomes necessary, not to defend it as a historic achievement, not to abandon it as an encumbrance, but to understand how its original logic has shifted. So I structure this lecture into two movements, or two periods if you like. First, why the treaty was signed. And the why is very important in this. And this is the period 1947 to 1960. This movement shows how a treaty born of post-partition insecurity and ambitious engineering came to define the subcontinent's water. Its purpose was predictable allocation, an attempt to impose order on the hydrological chaos of partition. The second movement, which I'll discuss, is why its logic, the logic of the treaty, no longer holds. I might be very definitive in that statement, so let's put it in another way. Why this logic has weakened in the present context, or why has it lost its shine in the present context. So this movement actually examines the post-1990s period, and this is about 35 years of the Indus Waters Treaty. So you had a period from 1960 to 89, 1990, that was the time when terrorism was flaring up in Kashmir, and then the 1990s to the present time. So this period, this era, is now being shaped by nuclearization, cross-border terrorism, judicial arbitration, resource nationalism, and the climate stress. So these are factors which have now added to the strength and the weakness of this treaty, and therefore the logic is under some pressure. So let's go back a little in time, a bit of 47, the negotiation of 1950s, and the eventual signing of the treaty on September 19th, 1960. It was signed in Karachi. It was the bustling port city and the economic hub of Pakistan. Two political leaders and a distinguished international banker convened to sign a document that would define, I think, the political and the hydrological landscape of the Indian subcontinent. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's Prime Minister, Field Marshal Ayub Khan, the Pakistan's military ruler, and William Iliff, the Vice President of the World Bank. They affixed their signatures to what became the Indus Waters Treaty. The World Bank, and this is very crucial, lent its institutional weight to broker a deal that neither nation would have achieved alone. A treaty was born, I think, from a very improbable mix. You had a Democrat, a democratically elected leader, Pandit Nehru, and you had a military strongman ruler, Ayub Khan, and then in between them you had a deal maker. I think it's a very interesting configuration. And this question about dealing with a military dictator at that time haunts us even today when we approach Pakistan in a certain way. Strictly speaking, the Indus Waters Treaty was never a water sharing agreement. And this is, I think, a huge misconception today when we look at the Indus Water. It was not a water sharing agreement in the very conventional sense, such as later the Ganga Treaty in 1996 between India and Pakistan. That was more a water sharing agreement. It partitioned the Indus River system. There was an apportioning of the waters. The basin itself was divided. The partition divided the land, and the basin was also partitioned. The western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, were allocated to Pakistan, and the eastern rivers, Ravi, Beas, and Satluj, came to India. The rivers were, as I said, eventually apportioned and not based on equitable water distribution. Had volume been the basis of allocation, it would have required 6 separate treaties, right? One for each river in the Indus system. So I think the engineers who were negotiating this treaty kept this humongous effort in mind, that if you look at water sharing in terms of volume, it will be an endless negotiation. And probably you would have had 6 treaties, which was unlikely to come out. So I think the engineers were quite clear and quite practical in their approach. They thought the basin needed to be divided. And I think the whole attention was, at that point of time, on the eastern rivers, which India valued very much. So after signing the treaty, Nehru never set foot in Pakistan again. He died in May 1964. Ayub Khan, meanwhile, and this is the irony of it all, Ayub Khan, the military dictator, consolidated his grip over Pakistan. His rule lasting till 1969, and it marked the longest uninterrupted stretch of power in Pakistan's history, entrenching the military as the ultimate arbiter of the state. And we see that even today. This history prompts enduring questions. Was the treaty inevitable? A hydrological corollary of the partition of Punjab? Was the treaty an act of unfair compromise for India? A bargain in which New Delhi bent over backwards to accommodate Pakistan's anxieties? Or was it instead a calculated generosity, an attempt to buy peace through water, even when peace itself was a difficult proposition with Pakistan? And if peace was the objective, and it was the desired objective, as we know now, how did India, fully aware of the regime it was negotiating with, arrive at such an understanding? We know very clear that Ayub was a military dictator, and in no sense would he be searching for lasting peace with India. And I think these questions are quite important even today, to reflect on our relationship with Pakistan and to ask a larger question whether water diplomacy can succeed where political trust has never taken off. So at the time of the partition, and this I'm going back to 47 for a bit, those who know our history would understand that it was contended that a joint development approach might have been more prudent and sustainable. A joint approach within India and Pakistan. And Cyril Radcliffe even proposed a shared system under a joint control. And both India and Pakistan rejected it. Jinnah declared very famously, and this is a very communal statement, he says, he would rather have Pakistan's deserts than fertile fields watered by the courtesy of Hindus. And Nehru equally, in response, and very firmly, says, what India did with India's rivers was India's affair. So you are at a point of time in 1947 where there is a certain rigidity over the resource. It's about guarding your water resources with no space to negotiate or talk about. This, of course, is 1947, and I think the atmosphere and the content of that period is very different. Interestingly, the idea of the joint river management quickly resurfaced after the partition. There were lots of proposals for joint technical assessments, third-party arbitration, and there was even a framework which was inspired by the US-Canada International Joint Commission. So these were ideas that were seeping in to India and Pakistan relationship on the water issues. But from 1947 to 1952 or about, I think the whole approach in the subcontinent between India and Pakistan on the water sharing was very ad hoc in its orientation. There wasn't a firm rule, there wasn't a framework, and so it was an atmosphere of constant complaint from Pakistan on water sharing, and there was, in a certain sense, a provincial rigidity on behalf of India, particularly from the Punjab engineers and the Punjab political leaders. They were very clear from 47 to 52 in particular, that the waters of Punjab would never be given away to Pakistan. And that was in a direct conflict with what Nehru was thinking. Nehru had a larger internationalist frame of mind. And that had a great conflict, the Punjabi way of thinking on waters and the Nehruvian approach to how we should share the waters with Pakistan. And I'll explain that a little later. So I think as the difficulties arose and as Pakistan led this campaign internationally about India being the bully and India stopping waters, especially on the eastern rivers, I think there became a need, a forced need to have a formal rule-based framework capable of governing water sharing and containing the tensions, And therefore, by 1951 and 1952, the World Bank is in India, meeting several people, including Nehru. And World Bank has been inspired by David Lilienthal, who is the chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the chairman of the United States Atomic Energy Commission. In fact, there's an interesting tete-a-tete between Lilienthal and Nehru in Teen Murti House. And Lilienthal is impressing Nehru that the best way forward between India and Pakistan is to have a dialogue, to share the water from a joint perspective. Because he says in one of his writings, he didn't want Kashmir to be another Korea in the making. So I think the US were particularly concerned about the tensions developing in Kashmir in particular over the waters. And I think this breakthrough and this India being pushed towards a negotiation is a very interesting account of the politics in the 1950s. And one of his writings in the Collier's magazine quite clearly brings out an objective, which I think is probably the US objective, is to push India into negotiation with Pakistan, and so that they could have a larger management of the conflict and the management of the tension of the region. Remember, the Cold War is slowly and gradually creeping into the international system. And the US administration is quite conscious of the fact that India is slowly and gradually leading towards the Soviet Union. And I think the World Bank becomes the sort of de facto instrument through which the United States starts coming into the Indus Basin, and thereby managing the whole political affair in a very surreptitious way, so to speak. Nehru, in his writing, is also very dismissive of this American agenda. I mean, it's not that he is not aware. He does write, and he's very cautious about Lilienthal's sweet talk about this larger development and engineering sort of outbreaks that the Americans are doing. But he did see the merit in a very data-driven dialogue, which means to assess the basin and see what is its water content and how probably India and Pakistan could come to some sort of arrangement. So I think by 1952, water diplomacy is starting to work. And India is, in my view, I think, in some sense, lured into negotiation with Pakistan. And I think this is a turning point. When people question the treaty, I would say that India should not have entered into a negotiation and continued with the ad hoc arrangement that had started from 1947, right? Despite the pressure or whatever. The moment you enter into a negotiation, it becomes a give and take. And you can't really then say that the treaty was unfair because you were very conscious of the fact that you were negotiating with Pakistan. And therefore, the challenge of sharing rivers that traverse borders has always, I think, troubled states, and India and Pakistan clearly encountered this in the 1950. There was a double bind, largely, globally, that was happening. This double bind, I think, was whether states should stress on absolute territorial sovereignty, which means do not concede, especially the upper riparian, do not concede on any water with its lower riparian, or whether the principle of equitable distribution of water exists. So I think this was a troubling time for both India in particular, the equitable and reasonable utilization. And I think Nehru was clearly shifting more towards the equitable and reasonable utilization of water, and therefore it fitted into his larger internationalism and larger global idealism of his. So this, I think, was clearly something that Nehru was embracing. And I think the World Bank intervention during the negotiation, I think, was very pivotal. It sort of brought in bilateral negotiation, which had earlier failed. And what did the World Bank bring? I think the World Bank brought in a great deal of trust. It brought in a great deal of incentives. But I think the most important element of the World Bank contribution was financial resources. And in large measures, the answer lay, I think, in funding, right? And a third party prepared to finance the infrastructure on both sides and thereby reduce mutual dependency became the linchpin of the agreement. And if you look at the representative of the World Bank, it's very interesting. The US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and West Germany, they all signed agreements to finance the Indus Waters Treaty. Most notably, 900 million Indus Basin Development Fund. So at the end of the day, it was the money that eventually moved the negotiation and got the two countries to sign. And I think there was this great thrust towards what is called engineering interventions on the Indus Basin. And mind you, India also contributed as required under Article 5 of the treaty. And alongside this, World Bank had various other bilateral agreements, financial agreements with the United States. So I think the Western countries had, in some sense, and this is a great example, not even the Marshall Plan, which existed before, clearly showed that, the Western countries could come together in financial aid program of this nature. And this is something quite striking because none of these were part of any military alliances, and nor these countries had any trade pacts. So in spite of that, to come around and to fund infrastructures on the Indus Basin is quite, I think, remarkable. Before I come to the more current context, I just would like to touch upon the international context of the 50s. I think it, in some sense, and to my mind, and through my reading and investigation, I think the international context shaped the treaty's contours. And it's something that we tend to ignore because we are so focused on the bilateral aspect that we forget the larger international impact of it. The Cold War loomed large. Washington's strategic interest in South Asia was unmistakable. For the US, the region was a critical frontier in its global contest with the Soviet Union, and drawing both India and Pakistan into its anti-communist orbit was a Cold War imperative for the United States. So aid, technical expertise, and the World Bank facilitating role functioned as a tool of strategic influence. And it aligned with President Eisenhower's Soviet containment policy. So by operating through the World Bank, the US subtly embedded itself in South Asia's geopolitical landscape, advancing its interest under the guise of development diplomacy. So you would remember that soon when the treaty was signed, Eisenhower famously hailed the Indus Waters Treaty as one bright spot in a very depressing world picture. And he saw that it was not just merely a technical agreement, but it became a global campaign for water for peace and atoms for peace, which Eisenhower was trying to create. And during his December 1959 visit to India, and I think he was the first US president, if I'm not wrong, to come to India in 1959, he addresses the parliament, both the houses. And he makes a very keen observation that, that India is as much aligned to America as America's former allies. And this was quite a statement that he made. Obviously, he's reaching out. And Nehru is quite impressed by Eisenhower's reach out to him. He's already made a statement saying there should be a joint declaration with Pakistan committing both countries to settle all disputes without force or war. He also is in support of, he is in support of Eisenhower's Atom for Peace because he values India moving on a civilian nuclear energy path. And he argues that at least the United States should help India in at least bringing out a plant of 50,000 to 100,000 kilowatt capacity. So that there was also a nuclear, peaceful energy interest that Nehru was trying to bring in. And therefore, I think Nehru was determined, therefore, to get the treaty signed because there, I think he felt was not only peace, which could then help India to develop properly, but also align strongly with the United States. I will try to skip the debate in the parliament, but I think for all readers or the audience who are interested in the Indus Waters Treaty, the 30th November debate in the parliament, 1960, is, I think, to my mind, a very telling debate. I think it really scrutinizes the treaty. All the questions that we are asking today about the treaty was very much debated in 1960. And you had these great parliamentarians who would question Nehru and his approach to the treaty. I won't touch upon that, but just to say that, remember the treaty was signed on September 19th, right? And the debate happened on 30th November. So actually, there was no real debate when the treaty was being signed. And it is a question that parliamentarians do ask. And Nehru responds by saying, well, the government has the right, the coextensive and co-identical powers. It's the government of the day that discusses and enters into a negotiation. So it has that prerogative. But I think it was unconvincing. And many of the members were quite unhappy with the outcome. They were asking the questions as the treaty was unequal, that we are giving more water to Pakistan, that Ayub was not the right person to negotiate with, etc. And this whole idea of peace that Nehru was championing was quite ridiculed, I think, in the parliament. And we are in IIC, Srinivas, when Nehru was responding to the questions on 30th November, he left the parliament and came to the foundation of IIC. The Prince and Princess of Japan were here, and they laid the foundation of the India International Center. So he left the Indus Waters debate to go for the laying of the stone, and then he didn't come back. And who asked the last question to Nehru on that day? It was the young parliamentarian Atal Bihari Vajpayee, questioning on how and why the government is not keen enough to discuss such critical and important issues as the Indus Waters Treaty. And he was quite, I was reading the debates, and he's quite annoyed with the government because whenever it came to India and Pakistan, the government was generally quiet on discussing any issues. There was the India-Pakistan rail link that was happening a few months earlier to the Indus Waters Treaty, and that too was not discussed in the parliament. So I think the parliamentarians in that sense were quite annoyed, and they were in many sense questioning this whole Nehru's idealism and this whole peace march that Nehru was bringing forth. And of course, with practical reasons, because Nehru felt that if there is peace, there could be development thereon. A lot of others were questioning whether peace with Pakistan was the right thing or not, because probably Pakistan was not good enough to carry the peace movement forward. Let me come to the last part in the next 10 minutes. The logic no longer holds, I think. That's what the theme is. And I think there are three shifts that we can look at. Shift one is Jammu and Kashmir, which emerges now as the central part of the Indus Waters Treaty. Remember, the emphasis when the negotiation was happening in the 50s was on the eastern rivers, the Punjab rivers, the rivers that passed the plains of Punjab. This is not to say that the western rivers were ignored, right? Because if you look at the treaty, our negotiators were very strong on the eastern rivers, 100% total control. But even on the western rivers, there were provisions that favored India or favored Jammu and Kashmir, 3.6 million acre-feet of storage capacity. Any number of run-of-the-river hydroelectricity project, any number, there was no defined number so long as it was run-of-the-river. And then there was irrigation facilities as well. So the Kashmiris who argue that the Indus Waters Treaty ignored them or even abandoned them factually is incorrect, because I think our engineers did look at, and somehow it's remarkable, and we must acknowledge N.D. Gulati, that how, while retaining 100% control on the eastern rivers, they could also manage such provisions on the western rivers, which was entirely for Pakistan. So the question that we ask today, that whether the treaty was unequal, factually is incorrect. Probably you can ask whether India should have entered into negotiation. That would probably be a better question to ask, because once, as I said, if you enter into a negotiation, it can become a very different game. But today I think there is a greater need of, there's a greater aspiration in Jammu and Kashmir. They need electricity, they need water for irrigation. The demand is high, and that therefore will impact the tone and tenor of the Indus Waters Treaty. India would now try to optimize the provisions of the western rivers, and that I think is going to be a turning point on the way we look at the treaty itself. There's been legislative resolutions which has challenged the treaty in Kashmir itself. So I think the economic entitlement that the Kashmiris are asking for and the resource sovereignty, an issue in Kashmir itself, will have an impact on the treaty. The second shift is the Kishan Ganga, which I think is a turning point. It sort of was a legal battlefield. Pakistan challenged India's run-of-the-river hydropower project. The issue seemed purely technical, all about heights, designs, and water levels. Yet the arbitration demonstrated that the treaty was no longer about hydrology alone. In its ruling, and this is very important because that is going to have an impact now, well, till we sort of put the treaty in abeyance, the court affirmed India's right to build the project, but it also imposed two critical restrictions. India must maintain minimum environmental flows into Pakistan, and India would be prohibited from using drawdown flushing to clear silt, a mechanism essential for long-term projects' viability in the Himalayan rivers. So the ruling was, to my mind, a certain paradox. India won the right to build, but with constraints that made the project more difficult to sustain. Pakistan won restrictions, but failed to block the dam. So suddenly the treaty was not merely a text of water sharing, it was a space where technology, international law, and diplomatic maneuvering shaped and influenced each other. This moment, I think, has turned all projects onto the Western rivers a technical exercise. And that technical exercise is one of legal strategic lawfare. Right? So that's the second shift. The third shift is terrorism itself, the cross-border terrorism and how it has impacted the Indus Waters Treaty. And this has emerged as probably the most important point of discussing the value of the Indus Waters Treaty. What value is the Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan where there is cross-border terrorism? And I think it makes a lot of public sense when you raise this point. And it emerges because diplomacy cannot go along when there is cross-border terrorism. So India declared the new red line: blood and water cannot flow together. In those words, which means water sharing has now become a tool of conditionality. Pakistan responded not militarily, but procedurally. Of course, it cannot respond too much militarily given what our strength is. But arbitration has become a method of delay from the Pakistani side. It's a diplomatic instrument to hold up the Indian projects in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think this is from the Pakistan perspective. The treaty is in abeyance, so where we are now and what are we going to do? I think the abeyance is a calculated intervention. It marks a very decisive shift. Water, which has long been treated as an apolitical domain of technical cooperation, now enters the repertoire of strategic instruments. The pertinent question, I think, is that the treaty will not endure in its present form. Right? The more important question, therefore, to ask is what this abeyance reveals about the nature of diplomacy in South Asia, where resource competition, security, and political behavior are becoming increasingly inseparable. For much of the post-treaty era, India approached water sharing as a domain set apart from conflict, governed by technical cooperation rather than strategic contingencies. The assumption was that rivers could remain insulated from politics. That assumption no longer holds. By placing the treaty in abeyance, India has for the first time linked hydrological cooperation to the question of cross-border security. And I think this shift is not rhetorical. It translates into measurable consequences for Pakistan's water stability, making basin cooperation conditional rather than presumed. The principle that once framed water as an unquestioned humanitarian norm has been replaced by a conditional regime of reciprocity. Right? And so the treaty logic has begun to change. I would say, and this is the last point I'd like to put, is that the treaty is now more a conditional framework. Right? And the most striking aspect of this decision is the conditionality attached to this treaty. It has stated explicitly that resumption of treaty mechanisms depends on Pakistan's credibly and irrevocably abandoning cross-border terrorism. So the abeyance, in a certain sense, is not a final judgment. It is an offer. Right? If anything, this is a negotiation strategy, not a termination of the treaty. India is not destroying an agreement. It is attempting to reshape the terms of engagement. And in so doing, India is declaring that treaties are not static. They are contingent on behavior, security, and trust. And this, to my mind, is a new approach that India is looking at, which I describe as conditional interdependence. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Srinivas.
I hope you are getting this speech circulated.
Yes, sir. It's getting recorded and it will be hosted on YouTube. So, can I request now Ambassador Kantha to share his thoughts on it? Yeah. to say, but I realized.
Let me begin by thanking Dr. Srinivas for asking me to be discussant, especially after, a very lucid, historically rich, and I would say strategically urgent lecture on antecedents, drivers, rationale, nature, and logic of Indus Waters Treaty. In the lecture, and more so in his writings elsewhere, his framing has been that the Indus Waters Treaty began as an engineering settlement insulated from politics, but has progressively migrated into a political instrument. That's a valid point, but he also argues about the technological robustness of the treaty, that it came out of certain data-based approach. I fully endorse very important point he made, that we should never look back on what happened in past in anger. We should try and understand the context in which certain decisions were taken, but there should be a second gaze to draw certain lessons, both on why something happened and how we can look ahead. Let me begin by acknowledging up front that I have somewhat different views on how robust the treaty was to begin with, as also the proposition Uttam has laid down, that once negotiations started, we were condemned to end up with a certain kind of treaty. As a former negotiator, it's very difficult for me to buy into that, because we always believe that negotiators have agency to shape outcomes. But let me confess that my comments here are really through warm's eye views, shaped by my limited and somewhat dated experience of discussing implementation Indus Waters Treaty with a specific reference to Tulbal Navigation Project, and this was in late 1980s when I was assisting then Water Resources Secretary Mr. Naresh Chandra, a very distinguished civil servant of the country. And subsequently, I could review some of those issues in context of China in somewhat greater detail when we were negotiating, and we are still, in fact, I'm not part of negotiations, but following transborder rivers that flow from Tibet into India. So I'll begin with some personal reflections from my participation in these two set of negotiations, which taught me three enduring lessons. One, which may appear to be somewhat mundane, but possibly most relevant in case of Indus Waters Treaty. Procedural delay can be a strategic objective, and accommodating the lower riparian through generous terms is no guarantee of the success of the treaty. I think that was a fundamental mistake which was made. Again, I'm not speaking with benefit of hindsight, not out of anger, but whole objective that somehow the treaty could result into peace with Pakistan. That assumption is somewhat questionable. In fact, if you look at Pakistan's objections to projects we have undertaken, especially on western rivers, which were essentially given to Pakistan with certain exception, they were all means to stall development in Jammu and Kashmir. They were undertaken with view to delay, weaken, and even subvert projects which we thought were quite viable and within contours of Indus Water Treaty. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the treaty by any logic was quite good from Pakistan's point of view, they never showed degree of sincerity, and they sought to wield provisional treaty as weapon. So this became a practical problem in dealing with Pakistan. Here it's very important to recall that when the Indus Water Treaty was signed in 1960, the process of codifying international law on the issue had barely commenced, or it had not made any headway. In the negotiations leading up to the UN Convention, the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Water Courses, concluded in 1997, the idea of shared natural resources cutting across international boundaries mooted but rejected out of hand by upper riparians. The best we could get, and we fall in both categories, upper riparian and lower riparian, as also middle riparian. Best lower riparians could get were two key principles of the convention. One, equitable and reasonable utilization of shared waters, and two, the obligation not to cause significant harm to downstream states. Now, neither India nor Pakistan or even China is signatory to 1997 convention, but one can argue that these two cardinal principles have become part of customary international law. Did we anyway violate these principles in case of Indus Water Treaty, its implementation? I doubt that. In fact, Pakistan will be well advised to exchange notes even now with its iron brother, China, to appreciate how generous India has been in upper riparian. I was involved in negotiations with China for quite some time on transboundary rivers. Very difficult negotiations resulted in 3 very niggardly memoranda of understanding. 2 on provision of monsoon season data from the Brahmaputra and Satluj, and third one which was for strengthening cooperation on transborder rivers. Data has been provided in a sort of episodic manner. Even now, in fact, 2 MOU, if I can recall correctly, are suspended. They have not been renewed. Not one project has been taken up under third MOU, which was meant to be sort of umbrella MOU for cooperation projects on transboundary rivers. Now, second lesson for me has been a somewhat linked lesson, that generosity without safeguards invites exploitation. Now, this is definitely within ambit of negotiations to put in place those safeguards. I refuse to accept that just because we started negotiations, we had to end up with a treaty which has no termination clause. Again, this is extraordinary that, if you look at other river water treaties, even one between, USA and Canada, it's a permanent treaty, but there is a provision for termination after giving 10-year notice. In fact, the treaty was subjected to very substantial sort of modification in 2024, as recently as 2024. India conceded 80.52% of aggregate water flows in the Indus system to Pakistan. And as Uttam mentioned, ceded much of the rights on the western rivers. as Uttam has mentioned in his writings, and he referred to that today also, it's probably the only treaty in the world that was not only volumetric, that is, in terms of water sharing, but also partitioning of a river basin. This is something quite unique and very ingenious and completely to our disadvantage. India also gave 62 million to Pakistan, 62 million pounds sterling to Pakistan. It was a big amount of money at that point of time, to help build replacement canals from western rivers. And there was a long transition period when provisions of the treaty were not implemented, with provision for extended it further if Pakistan needed it. Now, my contention is that such generosity is very unusual for an upper riparian. So problem is not that negotiations were held. Problem is that somehow we held those negotiations under duress. We need to, this is something Uttam has referred to, the international context in which it happened, the fact that USA was looking at the outcome of these negotiations as a geopolitical objective, rather than proceeding from point of view of equity or finding a viable technological engineering outcome. World Bank, yes, they did help with money, but their agenda was also shaped to a great extent by Western objectives, and the fact that Pakistan had already joined SEATO and CENTO by that point of time. Yet, generosity was not reciprocated with constructive cooperation. If you go into history of projects on western rivers where we had certain rights, it's not that we didn't have rights. Virtually every single project we mooted were objected to, delayed, weakened, and subverted by Pakistan. Dr. Sinha has argued elsewhere in his writings that Pakistan also used the waters dispute as a diplomatic weapon at the UN to further its claim over Kashmir. So the whole thing actually got politicized a long time ago. And parliamentary debate of 30th November 1960 that he has referred to is truly, it's an eye-opener. Because one, we could question government so frankly, ruthlessly, and actually point out many of the problems which came to the fore later. A third lesson is that technical clarity and the balance of rights and obligations matter. The Indus Waters Treaty, as it stands, is no longer a viable framework for cooperation, as Dr. Sinha pointed out. In fact, it was never a viable framework for cooperation. There are serious ambiguities in definition, for instance. When we're negotiating Tulbal navigation project, the whole thing about how to define a barrage, for instance, how to define Ular, that became a big hurdle. So many of the operational thresholds, annexures became rather loaded against our interests. And most importantly, as Dr. Sinha has very rightly pointed out again and again, there have been fundamental changes in circumstances since the treaty was signed, and that itself requires a very, sort of open review of the treaty. If you look at India's communication to Pakistan on 24th April 2005, holding Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, first I was a little puzzled to see that this communication was sent by our Secretary, Minister of Jal Shakti, as a demi-official letter. This is a terminology we use in Government of India for unofficial communication, rather than as a note verbal. Anything which is important has to go by note verbal. And, she referred to her counterpart as Mr. Murtaja, who was secretary from the Pakistani side. But the arguments she gave were very relevant. That referred to cross-border terrorism, security challenges that India is faced with, thereby making it difficult to implement, and secondly, breach of treaty. The fact that we were seeking amendment negotiations or modifications since 2023, and Pakistan had not even responded to that. And then, points, Dr. Sinha has referred to issues like population, demographic changes, climate change, need for modern infrastructure, whole technology of water management had changed. All that require, sort of revisiting the treaty. The lessons, I referred to here inform my conviction that the treaty's abeyance is not surprising. That's something Dr. Sinha also referred to. It's a logical consequence of decades of procedural weaponization and consequent strategic impatience on our part. I can tell you, 35 years ago, in fact, we started recommending, why can't we get out of this treaty? There's nothing new. Internally, we have been debating it for a long time. But termination or radical restructuring need not be punitive. And this is a very important point. A restructured regime can preserve Pakistan's legitimate consumptive entitlements while restoring India's sovereign right to develop its catchments and meet its own legitimate energy and food security needs. So there has to be a new equilibrium that needs to be worked out. I don't have time, so I'll not go into detail, but I propose to offer 4 set of remarks there. One, political evolution of the treaty and why its engineering logic no longer holds. Dr. Sinha has already talked about it. Second, strategic implications of India's recent decision to place the treaty in abeyance. This again, he has touched upon. It's not coincidental. It has certain, well thought out logic behind it, though it's a different matter whether terminology we used. Holding in abeyance is a strange term. It's not used in Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, use the term suspension. It's not referred to anywhere in Indus Waters Treaty. In fact, Pakistan, when this matter was being discussed in Permanent Court of Arbitration, they made this point repeatedly. And the supplemental finding of Permanent Court of Arbitration, which came out, I think, on 27 June this year, notes that. On politicization of treaty, there are 3 interlocking factors which are self-evident. One, of course, security and terrorism that Dr. Sinha referred to. Second, we discussed procedural weaponization. And third, environmental change and demand shifts, which have to be taken into account. So consequences, this treaty is inadequate. Its static architecture cannot accommodate security shocks, technological change, or climate-driven hydrology. I think this has to be acknowledged by us. Now, as for a strategic logic and limits of India's abeyance decision, logic Dr. Sinha has referred to, basically to reopen. Let's see if we can not only convey our unhappiness about what Pakistan was doing, not just a question of treaty, but also an issue of transborder mechanism. But we have to acknowledge what this decision doesn't achieve, because sometimes we tend to overread the decision. India's geographic and infrastructural reality limits the immediate hydrological impact of abeyance. India doesn't possess the large western river storage capacity that will allow it to withhold high volumes of flows during peak season. So real objective can only be in policy space. The ability to redesign projects, accelerate storage where feasible, and stop sharing certain operational data, which we are no longer doing. Actions that can create a degree of uncertainty downstream and have a disproportionate impact during low flow seasons in particular. Of course, there are legal and reputational costs. We should have no doubt about it. Putting Indus Water Treaty in abeyance doesn't give us satisfaction of taking the position that we are not bound by dispute settlement clauses of the treaty. Those clauses still apply because treaty is still there, even though it has been put in abeyance. Reputational cost, once again, since we want to be a sort of law-abiding citizen of Committee of Nations with certain normative values, it becomes a bit complicated for us. In bullet points, I'll just mention a three-track roadmap that we need to follow. One, domestic preparedness and calibrated leverage. This is most important. We need to sort of develop a pipeline of projects which are essentially in conformity with Indus Water Treaty. We need to work within, the four corners of the treaty because we are still a signatory to the treaty. But we don't need to be sort of at every stage our initiatives being subverted by Pakistan because we will not cooperate with them. There is the need for a diplomatic and institutional redesign. Dr. Sinha referred to. So I think we need to move towards a conditional Indus Water Treaty 2.0. This will be, dramatically different from the present edition of the treaty. It's doubtful Pakistan will buy that easily. But we can decouple water from immediate security, tit-for-tat approach to the extent possible, especially when it comes to humanitarian concerns, any downstream impact which will affect people of Pakistan. So I think getting out this punishment mode, that's very important because that will also help us diplomatically. And finally, we have to clarify our legal position. We have not done that. We had one press conference by Foreign Secretary. We had that demi-official letter from our Secretary, Ministry of Jal Shakti, but we have not quite, explained the rationale. One last point which comes up again and again is that has our decision weakened our negotiating position vis-a-vis China with regard to, for instance, this massive project on Yalung Sangpo they have initiated, which will be the largest hydropower project in the world. To that, my answer is categorical no. These two are not at all comparable. In fact, two countries, India and China, couldn't have adopted more different tracks than what we have done. What we are doing within IWT, Indus Waters Treaty, is also calibrated. Whereas in case of China, as I mentioned earlier, not only with us, but with all core riparians, they refuse to have any agreement which will impose any constraints on them. So in short, abeyance or abrogation of Indus Water Treaty does not weaken India's position. Looking ahead, while we can prepare for sort of reimagined Indus Water Treaty, the option of abrogation must be kept alive. Because without that, I can tell you as someone who has dealt with two of our pesky neighbors, will have no leverage. So they need to understand that this is there, and they also need to understand that reputational cost doesn't matter beyond a point. You just look at China's behavior on a whole lot of issues. Does it matter? Large countries can do a lot of things and get away with it. Likewise, legal cost. Who is taking us to a forum where we can be penalized? Very unlikely. So it is a subject as very well brought out by Dr. Sinha. It's a complex subject where knee-jerk reactions must be avoided. We must avoid language of punishment. Yet, we have to acknowledge that the treaty as it exists, Dr. Sinha made that point, is no longer relevant. It needs to be revisited, reimagined very substantially. I doubt Pakistan will agree to that. In the interim, we should pretend treaty is there, do whatever we think is correct, without being constrained by Pakistan, questioning all our decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think both the lecture and the remarks basically bring such I'm challenging questions, even though I was just thinking about what would be the kind of counterfactual imagination, like let us say, in the possibility of abrogation of treaty. I think it's quite fairly carefully thought intervention by using this Article 12.3 and then seeking basically renegotiation in that sense of certain parts of it. But if you look at it, would it serve the purposes? At least the fundamental reason why we are India sought that kind of renegotiation to stop the cross-border terrorism, that kind of issue. And second is about whether it would fetch better outcomes from augmentation of these Indus water resources. That's the second one. The third, which I tried to sort of allude to when I was opening up, was that the potential risks that are emerging in the Indus Basin. Would it help to cope with it, these possible risks, and particularly the risks of floods like Gloves? We don't know exactly the extent of risks at the moment. So if you start thinking from that point of view, counterfactual point of view, is there a particular advantage? Or we remain in this perpetually ambiguous situation of abeyance and then continue to do it and wait for the kind of responses from Pakistan. I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts about it when you respond to questions, but we can open for questions if there are any from the audience. Sure, sir.
Well, I'm Dr. Raghuvansh, journalist, earlier with the Hindustan Times. I have two very small questions for Dr. Uttam Sinha. One is, if the two principal leaders, Field Marshal Ayub and our Pandit Nehru, had not been there, would this treaty have been signed? Because, 1962 war came, Nehru died, 65 war with Pakistan came. And from 47 to 58, 59, we kept on negotiating. But only when Ayub became the field marshal, seeking legitimacy from the world, he might have agreed to this treaty. That's number one. Second is, we are talking about punitive. Water and blood can't flow. Can we have some kind of an incentive using water as an incentive for better relationship with our neighbor? Or is it too precious an item that today we can't use it with our neighbors because we have very troubled neighborhood? Can we use this as an incentive with our neighbors? Two questions.
Shall we take more? So,
Yeah, I'm Pradeep Gupta, ex-Joint Secretary Border Management. I have a question that you mentioned about the abrogation of this treaty. If, say, we go for cancel this treaty, and then in future definitely there is upper riparian, lower riparian. In that, how much is the chances that China will also muscle in? Then it will be 2:1 contest, like because the origination of the Indus system is in China. They will also, because we are part of the international groups, international community. So we may have to think in that manner also. Abrogation, because whoever devised this abeyance or the suspension, whatever it is, very wisely done. Abrogation or cancellation will definitely give chance to China to muscle in. That is one. Second, what was told that how to weaponize it, we can have a counter-cyclical thing. When they need the water, don't give. When they don't need it, you give. Already the data sharing has been reduced to some extent, but then we have to devise it very wisely. And since the instructions or the government has planned that we are keeping this treaty into abeyance, we have to find ways to do it in future. You rightly pointed out that the Indus water system, because making the dam and then planning for this thing will take a lot of effort. It will not be at least 1.5 to 2 decades. It may take a lot of money. So it has to be funded internally only. So this is one observation what I'm making. But then the China muscling its way, that we have to be very cautious about it.
Yeah. Sir, we'll take one more.
Yeah, Professor Sinha, recently there was a news that Pakistan is digging multiple rivers just to obstruct Indian forces to enter. That is one. Whether it's a military purpose, they are doing it. And second thing is about distribution of water. Haryana, Punjab water is going to Pakistan. Is it true?
Ambassador Kantha,
Should I? Yeah.
No, whoever.
Thank you for the questions. Let me delve a bit into the first question. Has a more historical context. Ayub Khan and Nehru, if they were not there, would the treaty have happened? I would say no, the treaty wouldn't have happened. I think negotiations would have gone on and on till it would have died, and there wouldn't have been a treaty. Before Ayub came, the political landscape of Pakistan, as you know, was completely unstable. 7 prime ministers changing almost every 1.5 years. And Nehru asks, in fact, when he's discussing this negotiation in the parliament, this is before the debate of November 30th, that whom do I talk to in Pakistan? I mean, of course, he wants to establish a diplomatic relationship. Diplomacy without cooperation is unstable. And he felt like being 2 countries, you needed to establish. But with whom? And that was the big question. Till, of course, Ayub comes. And Ayub has usurped power. He's ruling by decree. He's not committed to any parliamentary reality of things. He's ruling by force. And I think probably one of the first persons to make the statement about 80-20% volume divided the Indus Basin and favoring Pakistan was Ayub. He looked at it and said, well, I'm getting 80% of the water. What else can I ask for? And he comes in and he signs a treaty within 1.5 years. But I think there's a larger Ayub objective. As I said, he's ruled for a long period of time. He's balancing both China and America. He's clear about how Pakistan should sort of put itself in the larger international system. He is very happy with the amount of money that the World Bank is getting. And when you are a military dictator, you would like money flowing into your country because you have complete authority over this. There's elements of corruption, there's elements of legitimacy of certain issues. So I think he's quite happy with the way things are working. And I would also say that the earlier prime ministers in Pakistan never wanted the treaty, actually. Right? They rather would have a kind of a propaganda working against India internationally, because that was their political objective, to cast India in a very bad light. And the master of this was Zafarullah Khan. I mean, who would go around the world, especially in the United Nations, branding India as a water aggressor and stopping the water to its farmer and poor people. Very emotional. He was a great orator, by the way. And he would move, the members of the United Nations Security Council. So I think the objective of Pakistan was really to, and that was their propaganda machine working, and a propaganda machine which still works very effectively today. It all started with this water distribution and water sharing. So yes, Ayub changed the whole equation. Had Ayub not been there, I don't think the negotiation would have happened. Nehru, of course, wanted it to happen. He wanted peace. But peace with a certain purpose. I mean, of course, we look at Nehru as an idealist, as an internationalist, but I think his objective of peace with Pakistan was also very practical and pragmatic, because he wanted to move onto the developmental sphere of India. He wanted to get away from this, this so-called irritable and irascible neighbor, which he described Pakistan. He doesn't want to get locked into this and wasting so much of time and resources in dealing with Pakistan. He had larger objectives to fulfill. Therefore, peace was a practical option that Nehru was trying to achieve, and water sharing was a very destructive element in the two relationship. Water as an incentive today? I don't think so. I don't think we look at water as an incentive. Water for peace was in the 50s. We burnt our fingers, I think, to some extent. And to sort of revoke that idea that water can become an incentive in India and Pakistan relationship with cross-border terrorism happening doesn't make logical sense. I know the whole water for peace objective of the 50s was precisely this, to bring in elements of water to shape larger political relationship, right? Work downwards up. But given the context today, I don't think it's a very acceptable solution in the India-Pakistan relation. I know a lot of people have talked about a joint mega project in which both the countries share electricity, but probably that is too idealistic in a situation like this. And I think our government has made very strong claims about what it feels about Pakistan. So there is no engagement of that kind. Second, Mr. Pradeep Gupta as China being an actor. Well, we need to get worried about China, yes. And there has to be a lot of caution in the way we deal in the neighborhood, given China's overall footprint, whether it's Nepal, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. But we shouldn't be phobic about China. This overtly fearing China is not the best way forward. We should maintain our stance and position, the current position that we have with Pakistan. There's, by the way, the door is not entirely closed. Abeyance means that the door is still open. It's for Pakistan to reach out. This idea about India always reaching out to Pakistan probably is too much, I think, on our shoulder. It's time also that the lower Riparian reaches out to an upper Riparian. I think this upper Riparian being the villain has been quite well structured internationally, and I think this victimhood is played very well crafted by lower Riparian. That's not the case when India does with China. I think we have a lot of strength as a lower Riparian to build our capability and capacity and deal with China. Yes, we should be worried, but we should not overtly fear what the Chinese are doing, despite the fact that the Indus flows for about 170 kilometers in Tibet before it enters Jammu and Kashmir or Ladakh. I don't think the Chinese have great interest on that side. Their larger interest still remains on the Brahmaputra. On the third question, military purpose, is it true that Punjab Waters is going to... Yes, rivers have always been used as obstacles of military aggression. You dig canals so that you avert armored movement, and Pakistans have done that on the canals. We have done a lot of these things of flooding fields, through the rivers so that you stop armored movement, etc. So rivers can be used as, and history has shown that rivers and tributaries and canal systems can be used as instruments of warfare in several senses. Are we giving away water from Punjab to Pakistan? Well, if there is flood season, we'll need to give away water.
Which is what happened in August 25.
Yes, that's right. But remember, in all these issues of, as you said, don't give them when they need and give them when they don't need, that will require you to have effective infrastructures in places. And as you said, and rightly, that is a long-term sort of plan, 10 years, 15 years, huge investment. We've already started. And mind you, all those who deride the treaty must also know that what have we done to uphold the provisions of the treaty? On the western rivers, the 3.6 million acre feet of water that was given to us, storage water, we have only reached 0.7. So what is this complaint about? That the treaty has been unfair to India? The fact is that you haven't utilized your own provisions, which you negotiated with. So I think it's time to reflect on what we are doing with the provisions of the treaty. And my take is a very important one, which which Ambassador Kantha is all, the reputational cost. And I've always said that why do we have to say we'll stop the flow of water to Pakistan? That's a very uncultured way of dealing with even Pakistan, for that matter. Let's say we should optimize the provisions of the western rivers. That's a much better way, because you bring in the notions of development. You bring in the aspirations of Kashmiri people. That should be the line. Remember, in the 50s, this was the line which Pakistan went around the world saying that India is stopping the water. And that had largely affected our image. And image is a very important element in the international system. Right? Because, of course, now we can say it doesn't really matter to us because we have the strength to say it doesn't matter. But in the 50s, the image was very important because it was attached to several aid programs. It was attached to several military programs and defense programs. So we shouldn't get into this stoppage of water, etc. with Pakistan. We should focus on building our capabilities and capacity. Optimizing the provisions of the treaty is a nice way to say that we are looking at our own needs and requirements.